Hello, my atheist or agnostic friends. I'd like to share with you reasons why I believe the Bible is true and why you, as an atheist or an agnostic, can trust that there is actually a God in heaven. Of course, this video will not be able to convince you against your will. It will not prove that God exists, because no such video could be made. But you will have clear evidence, if you approach this with an open mind, that in fact the Bible is true and God is real. So we're going to look at it in three steps. The first is we're going to look at something called the strong anthropic principle. And the strong anthropic principle simply states that there seems to be evidence that this globe has properties that would not exist simply by chance. And then we're going to look at verses that were recorded long before Jesus was born, hundreds of years before Jesus was born. They talk about Jesus, and we're going to think about the likelihood that these things could be prophesied in advance of Jesus' birth. Finally, we'll finish up with a detailed look at 4 verses in the book of Daniel. And those 4 verses, when you first read them, they might seem cryptic, they might seem hard to understand, but when you look at them, they clearly say what's going to happen in the future. And it's just beyond imagination that the things that it prophesies would come true by accident. So those are our 3 steps. The strong anthropic principle is first. Verses that predicted Jesus' life on earth, and then a specific review of 4 verses in the book of Daniel. And what I'd like to demonstrate is that a person would have to disregard all probabilistic thinking to not accept that these things are true. You'd have to deliberately close your eyes and ears to think that these things are not true. So let's take a look first of all at the strong anthropic principle. The strong anthropic principle is demonstrated over literally hundreds of very finite, very careful observations. And I'm just going to go through, 2, 3, 4 of them. But there are hundreds. I'm not going to, of course, take the time to go through even 20, but you could just Google on the internet and you'll see that there are many, many things. So the first one I'll draw your attention to is the time it takes for the Earth to rotate, which is just less than 24 hours. And that's what we refer to as a day or day and a night. If that rotational period was different, say it was 3 days to rotate or 7, you can imagine the problems that would occur. You'd have scorching, terrible heat followed by awful freezing, and that would happen every rotational period. And so you would not have the Earth that we have that can produce fruit and mammals and all kinds of other things. So the rotation of the Earth just happens to be perfect. Gravitational force just happens to be the right amount. If gravitational force were stronger or weaker than it is, the chemical components in the atmosphere would not be right, and we would not have the correct mixture of ammonia and water and other things. Just happens to be the right amount of gravitation to pull the things we need in and release the things that we don't need. It just happens that the shininess of the Earth, the reflection of the Earth, the albedo of the Earth, is just the right amount. If it reflected more, then you'd have too much light reflected back out into the cosmos, and we would get awfully cold because it wouldn't be retaining the heat from that light. And of course, the other way around also. Then what about the moon? The moon is just the right distance from the Earth. Imagine if the moon were further away, our tides are going to recede. We're not going to have the tides that we have now. the seas are going to stagnate and die. So and again, you can multiply this times 50, 60, 70 specific other observations at least. And when you look at those, then you say, well, either we were lucky to the point of absolute absurdity, or there was some kind of design here. All right. And by the way, let's just presume for a moment, though, that we got somehow lucky to the point of absurdity. And in fact, all this stuff just happened on its own. Well, you still have to do a few other things. Among them are the right amino acids need to form in a primordial pond somewhere. They have to have the correct components for those amino acids to create themselves. Then they have to develop at that moment a cell wall to keep the things together, the right things together. And then at that moment and in that place, they have to also develop the ability to replicate. That thing has to be able to replicate, or all those amazing coincidences would, create one life and it would die. And then after you've got the right compounds, chemical compounds, turning into the right amino acids in the right place at the same time, with a cell wall and the ability to replicate, at that moment, then you need to have that dead thing turn into a live thing. And of course, before any of this, you have to have matter create itself out of a vacuum. Well, you can see there's a few probabilistic problems with that whole scenario. All right, then let's take a look at, by the way, Professor Stephen Hawking, who of course was an atheist, made this comment referring to the strong anthropic principle. One cannot help feeling that there is some deeper explanation. Indeed, interestingly enough, he himself rejected that feeling and said, no, I just feel in my bones that there is no God, and remained an atheist. But he admitted that, it sure seems like there is a God. So we've got this stuff. And by the way, sometimes mathematicians consider 1 times 10 to the 50th power to be functionally impossible. It's not theoretically impossible, but it's functionally impossible. In other words, if you have something that would only happen 1 in 10 with 50 zeros, if it would only happen that often, it's for all intents and purposes, it is impossible. And what we're talking about here is far, far less likely than 1 times 10 to the 50th power. So we're talking about being functionally impossible, though not theoretically, because virtually everything is theoretically possible. For instance, it is theoretically possible that I can go to a fast food restaurant and get a cup of hot chocolate, and I could take that cup of hot chocolate. I'm headed out the door when a windstorm picks me up, and it carries me to the top of Mount Everest, where I drink my hot chocolate, and then it carries me back and puts me on my front porch of my home. Theoretically, a person could imagine such a thing, but of course, as soon as I say that, you say, well, that's silly. I mean, that's just crazy. That's not going to happen. If I told you it did happen, you would instantly know that I was joking, or I just had lost my sense of reality or something. But the things we're talking about with the strong anthropic principle and the idea that matter created itself out of nothing and all of that, those are more bizarre. They're more unlikely. So that's something to think about. Now I want to take a look at some Bible texts, and I want you to think about this. I want you to think about that these things were predicted over many hundreds of years by a number of different people. They were written down. They were records at the time of Christ. So it's not like somebody after Christ's death made this stuff up. These were recorded in records that existed prior to Christ being born. So let's look at some of them. Here's one. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Well, we know that Jesus, in fact, entered Jerusalem on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So this was Zechariah. This is a long time before Christ was born, said he's going to come in on a donkey. All right, how about this one? They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Well, at Christ's death, the soldiers took his garments and they parted them and they gambled for them, they parted among themselves his garments. But then they got to the tunic, and the tunic was woven, and as soon as you tear it, you will ruin it. So they said, well, let's gamble for this. So they gambled, cast lots upon his vesture, his tunic. About this, they gave me also gall for my meat, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. You may recall that on the cross Jesus said, I thirst, and they held up something to him. That was vinegar. And I said unto them, if ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price, for my price, 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11:12. All right, so here's Zechariah saying that they're going to give 30 pieces of silver for him. That's exactly what Judas got. That also shows up in another prophecy as well. All right, so each of these were prophesied long before Christ was born, and they all came true. But maybe you think, well, the disciples maybe somehow changed the record, so it looked like those things happened, but they didn't really happen. So consider these things here. Here are four more prophecies. I want you to think about this, and this is again Zechariah, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced. So here's a prophecy that Jesus is going to be pierced. Here's Psalms 22:16. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. So Zechariah tells us they pierced him. Psalms tells us they pierced his hands and his feet, which we know is exactly what happened. And here we are in Deuteronomy. Now this is going way back. Deuteronomy is going way long before Christ. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God. So Jesus was going to be accursed of God on the cross, and Moses talks about it here in Deuteronomy, and he says that he'll be hanged on a tree, and don't leave his body all night on the tree. So Jesus was in fact hanged on the cross, and then he was taken down before sundown on that day. Here's the last one. In one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. This is Exodus. So this is again Moses recording this, talking about the Passover, referring to Christ, that they would not break his bone. So on the cross, they were going to break his bone. That's how they usually did it. But when they came to him, he was already dead. So they threw a spear in his side, and here we are. Neither shall ye break a bone thereof, it says, and that's what happened. Okay, so were these falsified? Well, certainly the references weren't falsified because they were there very long before Jesus was born. Did the disciples falsify them? I don't think so. The disciples later, most of them were martyred, and so that would mean they all chose to die making a lie. And more importantly, perhaps, for this purpose is they wrote books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they recorded these things in those books. Now, there were hundreds or thousands, perhaps, that saw or knew about Jesus' death. Now, those people that knew about Jesus' death, many of them were willing for Jesus to die. They had a reason to prove the disciples were wrong. Don't you think if they falsified Jesus' death and wrote down things that weren't true, don't you think the people who actually saw it would say, hey, that isn't true? But they didn't. And so we have these references that show us that long before Jesus was born, they told how he was going to die and some of the particulars of the death itself. So far we've looked at the strong anthropic principle. We've also looked at some texts that show that that things were predicted about Jesus, which would be exceptionally unlikely to be predicted if they were not shown to the people who predicted them in advance by someone who knew. Now, I want to stop right here because we're going to get to the strongest prediction right now. And I want to stop right here and say to you, it's important that you know that the book of Daniel was just the way we have it now when Christ was born. So the book of Daniel tells us when it was written, but I would like you to just know that's true. And if you don't know it's true, then Google or go to Wikipedia or however you get your information and go look up when was the book of Daniel written, and you will find typically two ideas. One is that it was written when it said it was, and that's like 5-6 centuries before Christ was born. The other is, well, Daniel is so specific in the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. No one could have recorded history that way unless history already happened. So then those people, those revisionists say, well, it must have been a couple hundred years before Christ. Well, it was actually 5 or 6 centuries. But if you want to go with a couple hundred, that's okay with me, because for purposes of this presentation, all I want to make sure you know is that it was intact the way we have it before Christ was born. Because I don't, as I'm presenting this stuff, I don't want you to wonder, well, that's so specific, it must have been written after the events actually happened. No, it wasn't. So if you have any question about that, stop the video, go check stuff out and find out when was the book of Daniel written. You can look at Christians, you can look at non-Christians and find out that answer. All right, so now that we know that the book of Daniel was just the way we had it, hundreds of years in advance, I want to look at the actual verses that we're looking at, which are Daniel 9:24-27, which reads like this. 70 weeks, this is the King James Version, you can pick any version you want. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall come, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. I know that's a real mouthful, and it sounds perhaps like too much and too hard to understand, but it really isn't. So let's take a look at several key points in this paragraph. And as we think about this, I'd like to suggest to you that Jesus here puts these verses under a microscope for atheists and Christians and agnostics to say, let me tell you in detail what's going to happen in advance, so that when it does happen in advance, you'll know that that was my voice. All right, so here they are. Here are the definite points. And you may, if you have a Bible in your home or someone you know has a Bible, you might want to look this up and make sure that I'm telling the truth. It's Daniel 9:24-27. We just read these verses. I'm going to give you a summary of some data points. If you want to, look up Daniel 9:24-27 to make sure I am telling you the truth, that these are really there. Number one, exactly 70 weeks was determined upon the Jewish people. Not around 70 weeks or little more than a year, but exactly 70 weeks. Not one day less, not one day more. The commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince was to last 69 weeks, of which it was made up of two periods. There was a 7-week period and there was a 62-week period. So we see 7 weeks and then 62 weeks and then Messiah the Prince. During the 69-week period, Jerusalem was to be rebuilt from the devastation caused by Nebuchadnezzar. Number 4, a prominent feature of that rebuilding process was building the wall, and that building process was going to occur during troublous times. Number 5, after 69 weeks, Messiah would be cut off, but not for himself. Number 6, the Messiah would confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And number 7, in the middle of that week, the Messiah would cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So let's see how it turned out. First of all, the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince was 69 weeks, made up of 7 weeks and 62 weeks. All right, well, the first thing we have to figure out is, when was the commandment to rebuild and restore Jerusalem? Well, there are typically 3 dates that are suggested from 3 different kings. 3 different kings gave messages to the Jews of peace, and you can go back and rebuild. But 2 of those we're talking about the temple, and the third one was talking about Jerusalem being rebuilt, during which time the temple would also be rebuilt. So only one of those, and that the king was Artaxerxes, and that was in 457 BC. Artaxerxes commanded them to go back and rebuild the city, and including the temple. And we have that in Ezra and Nehemiah. So the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah talks about that rebuilding. That was in 457 BC. You can look that up. You can see if that's true. So starting with 457 then, the next thing we need to do is find this 7-week period. Well, if you look at 7 weeks or 69 weeks and you say, well, okay, the Messiah the Prince is supposed to come in 69 weeks. And so you look there and you say, well, Jesus didn't come in 456 or 455 BC. So, what happened here? The prophecy is not true. But it is, because actually sometimes in prophecy the Lord uses shorthand. And the shorthand he uses is a week of prophecy is, a day of prophecy is a year in actual time. So we have that with Ezekiel. Ezekiel was told to lay on his side for a number of days, lay on his left side for a number of days, lay on his right side for a number of days, and the Lord told him directly, each day is for a year. So it represented years, but he was told to lay on his side, one side and then the other, for days. We had that with the children of Israel. The spies went in and looked at the promised land. They were unfaithful. They were not honest about the challenges that were there. It caused the people to be afraid and not go in and take the promised land when they should have. And the Lord said, okay, you're going to have to be in the wilderness for 40 years. And so we're going to do 1 year for every one day that the spies were looking at the land. And we have Jacob, Rachel. He wants to marry Rachel. He makes a deal with Rachel's father Laban, and he says, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel. But he refers to those 7 years as a week. So a week, 7 days, equals 7 years. So if we take that principle then, and we say, okay, well then let's presume that these weeks that we're talking about are actually not weeks of days, but weeks of years. Well, that would be 69 times 7 years. That would be, the first section would be 7 weeks, and 7 weeks would be 49 days, and 49 days then would be 49 years. So if we take 457 BC, we roll forward 49 years, what we find is that rebuilding of the temple that 3 kings talked about, that is completed 7 weeks after 457 BC. All right, so that got us somewhere. Now we still have to get to Messiah the Prince. Now we had 62 weeks, which is 62 times 7, and we take those years and we roll them forward. What we get to is 27 AD. Now, if you actually do the math on it, what you'll come up with is 1 year different, probably, because there is no 0 year. So you go from 1 BC or 1 BCE to 1 AD, and so our brain thinks in terms of 0. So you would go from 2 to 1 to 0, 0 to 1. But the way the numbering system was set up, it simply went 2, 1 BC, 1 AD. So you'd get a one year different. But in fact, it brings you to 27 AD. That is the exact year that Christ began his ministry. So we have the 7 weeks that turned out to be exactly right. We have the 62 weeks that turned out to be exactly right. Let's see what else we have. During the 69-week period, Jerusalem was to be rebuilt from the devastation caused by Nebuchadnezzar. It was. Now you say, well, no big deal. I mean, all cities are rebuilt. Well, they're not actually. Where's Nineveh today? Where's Tyre? Where's Babylon? A prominent feature of the rebuilding process was the rebuilding of the wall, and that happened in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah is all about building that wall, and it was going to be rebuilt in troublous times. And what happened in those troublous times is the surrounding nations didn't want Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And so they reported to the king of the region, of really the whole developed world at that time, that part of the developed world, that Jerusalem was a seditious city and so forth and so on, and the king stopped the builders from building rebuilding Jerusalem. The wall was built under Nehemiah very quickly, but it was troublous time. So Jerusalem itself was started and stopped. The wall was built all at one time, but it was during this troublous time where people were trying to stop the work. And Messiah was cut off, but not for himself. He was cut off for us. In the middle of that week, that is, that 7-day period from 27 AD to 33 AD, 34 AD, in the middle of that, 3.5 years in, Jesus died for us. And then the other 3.5 years, the disciples and the apostles continued to evangelize the Jews in and around Jerusalem, in Judea. But there was agitation and there was rejection of the message. So at the stoning of Stephen, then the message, the apostles and the believers were scattered all over, and the message went to the Gentiles. So when it went to the Gentiles, that sealed the probation for the Jews. That does not mean Jews will not be saved after that time. They certainly will be saved after that time, but their probation as a nation, saying that they were special, they were set apart, they were not like Gentiles. From that point forward, the Jews were like Gentiles, and they can be saved just as Gentiles can be saved, but not as a separate nation. So the covenant was confirmed for 1 week. All right. Well, we've looked at the strong anthropic principle. We've looked at references that were authored hundreds of years before Christ was born, and we see that those turned out to be true. We've looked at 4 verses in Daniel which perfectly match what happened, not more or less matched or very good match. They perfectly matched what happened, and those were those words were written 600 years, 600 years before Christ was born, and then they happened right on schedule like that. So, how did that all happen? Well, it could be chance. Well, it could be, but it's very, very, very unlikely. So the question is, why not give God a chance? Why not say, well, it's an incredible thing that this earth is here just like it is, that life came from dead things, that matter came from a vacuum, that the dead thing that came to life changed through generation after generation after generation. By the way, think about this. Males and females in each species had to evolve at exactly the same place and exactly the same time, because if males and females don't evolve at exactly the same moment, they don't fit. They don't have babies. So that has to happen, how many hundreds of thousands of times, where just at the right time, the male and the female happen to evolve to match each other, and and the matching pair happen to be in the exact same location together at the exact same time. So we have all that. And then that this stuff happened to Jesus it was recorded and it just happened to match Jesus. And this prophecy from Daniel just happened to match exactly what happened in secular history. Since that's exceedingly unlikely at best, don't you think it makes sense to give God a chance? Don't you think it makes sense to quietly go to your room and pray to God and ask Him if He exists? Get a Bible, either yours or someone else's, and read it. Try reading the Bible. Try reading through the book of John. It won't take you very long. Maybe, 3-4 hours, maybe. I don't know. It won't take you very long. Read through the book of John. Maybe you're thinking, well, I'm too smart and I would be too embarrassed to admit that I have some question about whether God exists. Well, think how smart it is to say I'm going into eternity, whether I'm a Christian or I'm not a Christian. Eternity rolls on, so I'm going into eternity hoping that in fact my teachers told me the truth when they said that there was no God. Think how smart that is. Isn't it a lot smarter to say, if there is a God, I'm going to err on that side because the penalty is too great if I'm wrong. So if any of this intrigues you, if you'd like to know more, feel free to write me. It's rwmontague@gmail.com. rwmontague@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you.